Bon, je pense que je...
Okay, and I think that I will be in charge of launching the debate. Please. So I'm the moderator in charge, and I'm also in charge of checking the clocks, but we have to stick to the agenda. And I will start by showing the good example by having a very shortened uh, presentation. I have a long speech prepared for you, but I'll have to make things shorter. And I'll try to defining the terms of what we're going to discuss. And the topic is Europe and the end of the Pax Americana. So let's define the perimeter together. Pax Americana, so the term is in line with what was called Pax Romana. It reminds us of the Roman Empire. So the United States are not an empire, because when you talk the American empire, it's more like a metaphor to show how powerful the country is. It's kind of a superpower, a super state. But I think it's quite adequate to talk about the United States as Raymond Aron said is an imperial republic. So this role of an imperial republic, from a historical point of view, it has filled with contradictions and reluctances, and we had very national um, republic and sometimes very local republic. You look at the primary elections in each state. So once again, we are very uh, typical approach to democracy, but they also have global responsibilities. So we have to work on both aspects of what this imperial uh, republic is. So this is why we talk about the reluctant sheriff, and the United States remain the reluctant sheriffs. We talk about the police of the world, but it's more like a sheriff, and they're reluctant to being sheriffs. So all these reluctances are highlighted after the elections of Donald Trump. Even though there's nothing new, but they are now on the front line. They and was true in 2016 is even more true in 2024. And the question is, how can these U.S. International policies are tilting towards isolation? It may be very difficult, but if it's currently in all the speeches, and this great withdrawal may have a huge impact on alliances in Asia, in Europe, etc. And those who will benefit are the neo-Maoist China and Russia. We're talking about a new Congress of Yalta. We get to have a very large idea of what Yalta was, how big powers shared the world, because even though the General de Gaulle was not at the Yalta conference, and we consider they may have some new Yalta conference with Xi Jinping, with Vladimir Putin, and now Donald Trump. We have evidence that it may happen, but at the same time, we have a lot of contradictions. We get the feeling that the MAGA sect was in full control of the United States, but in spite of this, we get a feeling that we have some what we call regalian uh, powers are still very active and they're resisting this MAGA sect. And we try to show that a different path is possible, while at the same time we're facing contradictions and turbulences. We think of William Shakespeare when we talk about the US, but also Europe was already mentioned this morning. In Europe is currently facing a series of challenges, but also opportunities. And sometimes we tend to consider, well, we'll do the best with what we've got. And it's a good way to start to be in control again. So I wanted to say that EU is not a global geostrategic actor, and it's not. And Pierre Manon called the Ciceronian uh, moment, the moment where we move from one a republic to the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. So this very first crisis we're currently facing. And furthermore, we also think with a pan-European perimeter, we also need to consider the UK, but also Norway, Iceland. And I would personally say it's important to consider Greenland because currently Donald Trump is jeopardizing the sovereignty of Denmark on Greenland. A short reminder that Ukraine is the first line of defense of Europe. I don't want to be provocative, but what about Turkey? Because there's no doubt that Turkey is not European and it doesn't belong to the EU, but it's a NATO member. In the southeast part of Europe is essential to have Turkey. It's important to have them close to Ukraine. So can this Europe be led by the four biggest powers? You have London, Paris, Germany, Poland. Poland is becoming more and more a prominent actor. Maybe we could add it to Italy and become a G5, a short list of big powers in Europe who may become leaders for Europe. And it may be a good opportunity to have an internal pillar as a backbone of the NATO organization. So we could act locally, we could act strategically, while at the same time preserving our skills and the alliance with the US. Because we see a complete reshuffle of powers and responsibilities. Or should we see sharing of the territories, but of responsibilities, while at the same time the US will remain at the head of the NATO. Because we have a NATO meeting in Den Haag, in The Hague, between the 24th and 26th of June. So this is why we have some stakeholders and some speakers. So we all would be being introduced. I will not review the whole list, but a short reminder that each participant will have 10 minutes to talk. I think, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes. We try to make things shorter. And once these participants have the opportunity to talk from the armchair or the pulpit, you'll have the opportunity to answer some questions. And I think we'll have enough time to answer a few questions from the audience. Let's start with Dan Twining, you're president of the International Republican Institute and is part of the geostrategic and political debates in the US. And he's going to tell us about the current debate in the US regarding social security, international affairs, and the potential orientations for the future in terms of applied geopolitics. And is there a great geostrategy in the US? Bonjour. My name is Daniel Twining, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
Of my life as a student in Brittany. I'm ready to spend the summer in Normandy. I don't think I want to go home. Thank you very much for all of your hospitality today. And I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. So I would like to contest a little bit this idea of a grand retranchement. Maybe it looked that way at the beginning, including when we were organizing this conference. We have had 3 American presidents who did, I think, want to retreat, pull American power back from the world. President Obama, the first President Trump, President Biden in different ways. President Obama withdrew all American forces from Iraq. He did not enforce the red line in Syria. President Trump flirted quite seriously with leaving NATO in the first term, with pulling US forces out of South Korea. He did not do that. In fact, there were more American forces in Europe at the end of the first Trump administration than at the end of the Obama administration. The Trump administration actually increased the American military presence in Europe. President Biden disastrously withdrew American forces from Afghanistan, I think left our allies in the lurch. As a consequence of that very unilateral and disastrous strategic decision, President Putin saw that, and I think that influenced his decision to invade Ukraine. And here we are. The jury is still out on the Trump administration. We're only a few months in, and I don't work for the Trump administration, so I'm just going to tell you honestly what I think. What I think is that we actually have a form of American hyperactivity. The administration is negotiating new trade agreements with over 60 countries. The administration wants to referee, help negotiate historic conflicts between India and Pakistan, between Israel and its neighbors, between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of getting into the middle of things, actually. We've just seen a very successful NATO summit where the President of the United States said, my views have changed, I support this alliance, right? NATO's in a better place because Europeans are significantly increasing defense spending. I don't think you're doing that because of us. I think you're doing that because of Vladimir Putin. It's appropriate and overdue. I'm sure General Lute can relay that every American president since at least President Eisenhower has been hoping that Europe would do more to maintain our common defense. That's happening. Thank you. I think that's an alliance success story. I'm sorry about the consequences that are determining it. So I don't think America's in retreat. I don't see retrenchment. Actually, I think President Trump wants to assert American power. We've certainly seen that in Iran, where I think the American action was quite bold. We can talk about it and perhaps debate it, but that was the boldest use of American power, military power, actually in a very long time, I think to quite good effect, because the consequences of Iran actually developing and deploying a nuclear weapon are a disaster, not just for the United States, not just for the region, but certainly for Europe. So I don't agree with the idea of the grand retranchement. I think we can all debate, and maybe there are some problems with the style and the approach. But here's what's interesting. I think President Trump wants to assert American power and American leadership when he talks to his voters about making America great again. He's not talking about American decline. He's not talking about the end of Pax Americana. I think he's talking about the opposite, right? Let me give you some polling information, because I think what matters is less what elites think and what American people think. I'm a member of the Reagan Institute Strategy Group. The Ronald Reagan Institute, named after our former president, does polls twice a year. And they just released their summer survey. So this came out just a couple days ago. And I want you to know that nearly 2/3 of Americans say that the United States should be more engaged in international affairs. That's up more than 20 points over the last 2 years. America should be more engaged in international affairs. A bipartisan majority of Americans believe that U.S. international engagement benefits America, 66% of Americans believe that, and U.S. engagement benefits the world, 67% of Americans believe that. Americans of all political stripes want America to lead in the world. That includes 65% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans, and 73% of MAGA Republicans. I don't know how MAGA translates in French. Make America Great Again Republicans. These are the voters who voted for Trump. 73% of them, more than Democrats, more than regular Republicans, say they want America to lead in the world. Support for isolationism is falling in the United States, according to public opinion research. Fewer than a quarter of Americans, 23%, would prefer that the U.S. be less engaged in the world. That's down 10 points from last year. Isolationism has declined 10 points in the United States in the last year. MAGA Republicans, so self-identified Trump followers, are more supportive of American global leadership than voters overall. 64% of voters overall in America support American global leadership. 65% of Democrats support it. This year, 74% of MAGA Republicans, of Trump voters, 74%, 3 out of 4, say that US involvement in international affairs is beneficial for the United States. Asked, this is quite interesting because I think there's also a conversation about kind of a new realism in the American approach to the world, a new form of transactionalism. We've certainly seen that on display with NATO, with trade partners, with Russia and Ukraine. But this question, this last question I'm going to mention is very interesting. And the question was, and I hope you appreciate this in France as the home of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The question was, should the United States stand up for human rights and democracy wherever possible in the world? Now, you might think most Americans would say no. In fact, most Americans say yes. A supermajority of Americans say yes, and that includes 84% of MAGA Republicans. 84% of self-identified Trump voters say America should stand up for democracy and human rights in the world wherever possible. Now, sometimes we can't. I run a democracy institute. Sometimes it's not possible, right? But most of the time we should, and most Americans actually believe that. I think this gives us a lot to work with as allies. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to close there because I think it's worth reflecting on American public opinion and the fact that maybe what you're hearing from elite opinion is not representative of American sentiment. And I think American sentiment means that our allies have a lot to work with, and we who want to see America leading in the world have a lot to work with, and now the burden is on our political leaders, Republicans and Democrats, to exercise that kind of leadership. Thank you.
Bien, merci pour la densité de votre propos.
Well, thank you very much for the density and the richness of your speeches and for being so brief. And now I'll give the floor to Nicolas Bavrez, and he will tell us more about the Europe's moment. Is it really like a momentum, like an impetus? Is it a truly renewed energy, or what are the outlooks? What are your ideas? Thank you very much, Europe. Have to rebuild after the Second World War based on 3 pillars: the European guarantee for safety, the threat of Soviet Union, and the idea that peace was born out of trade and law. And these pillars are truly jeopardized and challenged now. We no longer face the threat of the Soviet Union, but now we're facing the Russian threat. It's more present than ever. We know of the high-intensity wars in Europe and the hybrid war against our countries. The second principle is that the US are now challenging the guarantee they gave to the continent, and they're moving to a more liberal democracy. And thirdly, no one can say that trade and law create peace in a world where force is more important than the law. So the Europeans wanted to think that the 21st of century would belong to John Locke's philosophy and Ricardo's principle on free change and Tocqueville, because when we talk about Tocqueville, we have democratic society and the weaknesses of democratic. So we talk about Thomas Hobbes, Karl Marx, and Nietzsche, with the Übermensch, and Max Weber, the permanent struggle of gods. And so we wanted to believe that war would be impossible now and peace will be perpetual. But unfortunately, we face a world where the peace is impossible and war doesn't seem to end. And this is why I wanted to tell you that we are currently facing a world of predators and empires, and Europe is facing a crisis. And I wanted to tell you why this American Revolution is a major shock, the worst than since the 30s, but it's also a great opportunity. But we need to keep on trying to find this energy autonomy for Europe. So this is a brand new and groundbreaking sequence. And Solzhenitsyn said that we have nodes in a history and we have crisis. And So we have 1914, 1945, 1989, and now we're facing a new history node since the invasion of Ukraine and this new second mandate of Trump. So we have authoritarian regimes and democracies, and we see the collapse of the international order. And now we think that force is more important than the law. The multiplication of wars, Ukraine, the Middle East, India, Pakistan, and these wars have a terrible effect and consequences on civilians. And everything becomes a weapon. Migrants, trade, currencies, payments, and obviously the second election of Donald Trump is a clear disruption. So we see that we have liberal democracy, some evidence that they are quite more similar to authoritarian regimes, and it's a real shock for Europe. Europe was born out of NATO, born out of US's aid after the Second World War and the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Soviet Union. So now we see that America decided to change its mind and they're becoming more aggressive, most notably with Greenland. And sometimes Donald Trump even considered Europe to be America's biggest foe, even before China, and he brought its support to far-right parties in some European countries. And it's a true challenge, and the UK will remind you that intelligence agencies are directly linked to the US, and US helped rebuild Germany and the former Soviet republics now rely on US's aid. So once again, it's a big challenge, probably the worst we have to face since the 30s. We are an aging continent, and we need more weapons. I'll give you a lot of figures, and we know that the military budget for Russia represents 460 billion euros. It's quite similar to what we have. And Russia will build 4.5 million drones. And they build more than 800 tanks, while in Europe we only build approximately 50 tanks. So we be fully realistic when it comes to Russia and really be serious about the hybrid wars with Russia. And we know the governance is very rational in Europe. We have political differences, but at the same time it could be an opportunity because Europe used to belong to an unsustainable governance. We depended on Russia for energy, from China for manufacturing, or depended on the US for security, and it was no longer sustainable. And now it's true that we have this continent with true assets and true advantages and real wealth. But you see that the situation is so uncertain and stable in the US that capitals are fleeing from the US and they come to Europe. And the investors and financial institutions are once again interested by Europe. So euro is strong now. We have the rule of law, the capitalism is highly regulated, and some companies are global level companies. So what's important is we can make sure that we can be autonomous as we want us to be. There's a clear awareness. I will remind you that since 2022, the military budgets are increased by 30%. The UK have created a new nuclear options, and Germany will spend $88 billion for defense, be the fourth biggest investor. Poland spent 4.1% of its budget in defense, and the Nordics invested a lot trying to defend the Baltic Sea in case of a Russian offensive. So something's happening, but we can go even farther, and this is why we need to answer three questions. What do we want to do? And for me, we clearly want to have a realistic objective to guarantee the continuity of our institutions and the safety of our continent in a world of empires. And we have to do this with the United States if we can, and without the US if we have to. We can work with the Britons. It has nothing to do with the EU, it has to do with states. And I think that the Union should be in charge of funding and building infrastructure and nothing else. So we should get rid of all those regulations, all these norms with the European Defence Act that will allow us to work on defense and avoid having too many standards, too many norms, CS3D and non-financial reporting. This is what the EU should care about, and the figurehead can only be Mario Draghi. Secondly, we need to have a board of nations with the UK, so we can steer rearmament, and we can have a good coordination with armies, and we should give the priority to Europe when we buy weapons, and we should get rid of all the lies. And I think the NATO summit in The Hague was a disaster because the US keep on pretending to defend the Europeans, but the Europeans committed to spending 5% of their budget in defense, which is a lie. 3.5 on defense and 1.5 on infrastructure, it's a complete lie. And this is a clear example of what we shouldn't do. The strategy war we have to be realistic. And when we start to have lies and stories and we alternative history, it's a lie.
This is why we are at a moment of truth here. Years to come are really going to be decisive. Europe doesn't have the time. We don't have 10 years. It's the next 5 years coming that will be key. And as it was said before, we must conduct a military rearming, but also a political and moral rearming. And I want to leave you with a phrase from the end of the conference, the Husserl conference, who invented phenomenology. In 1933, he was to the anti-Semitism law, and he was revoked from the Freiburg University by his student, Heidegger. And a few years before his death, he had the authorization to leave Germany, and he did a few conferences, and one in Vienna, a very famous one, on the humanity crisis in Europe and in Europe. So in 1935, this is how he concluded. The crisis of European existence has two endings: the decadence of Europe, or the fall in hostility and barbarism, or the rebirth of Europe from philosophy thanks to reason, heroism. The biggest danger for Europe is weariness, fatigue. And I think this was well said, which would lead to a new Yalta. The opportunity for Europe is the heroism for reason, when the United States seems to tend to irrational and illiberalism. Thank you. Thank you very much for this brilliant review and this philosophic review. So I will now leave the floor to General Andrzej Kahn on the increasing role of Poland in Europe And I think it's a topic that comes back very often for the last few years. So which are the perspectives? Will we have a narrow cooperation between Paris, Warsaw, London and Berlin? Is it going to be a driver, and will it contribute to create a European pillar on the transatlantic alliance?
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for organizer Tocqueville conversations. It's a big privilege and honor for me. I've never been before. Hundreds of years when I was in the beautiful Normandy. So emotionally, for me as a Polish is great privilege and honor. So thank you very much. My special thanks go to Lord Mandeville, to the lovely lady. She motivated me to be here, and I have to say, Lord, you are right. Absolutely. This is proper place. The Poland is mentioned anywhere I go as a kind of example. And sometimes I think that we should move a little bit from talking about how great we are, how much we spend for defense, and all of the numbers, all of the contracts, and we should focus more about the future, what to do with this potential we're just gathering right now. But just to make some order, I would like to say a few words about the facts, the things we know, the things we understand, and then to go to the questions about what we know and which will be difficult to understand and difficult to answer the questions. So Poland, 40 million people living in the central point of eastern flank / eastern front. That's for soldier always the big challenge to translate who is front, who is in the flank. For us it's easy. Russia is in the front. Russia is the historical threat and enemy. We're spending 5% GDP, nearly. It's like a 4.1, and then with the aspiration to spend more, which is good. It's not because we are romantic or we are not rational. We are not Russophobic. We are Polish, so we know the history. We have a very bad experiences, and we see what happened, not only Second World War, but also 2008 in Georgia, when the President Kaczynski been there with a very important message to the world. 2014, a little green man in Crimea, and 2022. So if you're living in Poland, in strategical highway, and the highway goes from Moscow, then to Smolensk, very symbolical for Poland for many reasons, then goes to Minsk, Belarus, Brest, and then we have Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris. This is Highway 1. Still historically going up and down. Any kind of projection was always going through the Highway 1, and we are in the middle. So 5% for us is not only great achievement, but also huge political and economical and social risk we're taking. Because 5% is spending money for sophisticated, very modern equipment generates more and more costs in the future. We know it very well. So we try to spend it in a smart way. Entire list of contracts which is already signed. F-35s, the fifth generation airplane. So I'm really not agree with Mr. Musk. He says we don't need fifth generation airplanes, we need only drones. And I'm looking in Israel and Iran, I think the F-35 is a nice instrumentarium from some reasons, not only conventional. And totally, Poland and Finland in the eastern flank, we will have 100 fifth generation airplane. It matters. It matters. So we have to build and design how to use it properly to achieve strategical objectives. M1 tanks. So you said that only the production is about 50 tanks in Europe, which is true. But we don't care, because if there's a will, there is solution. So we bought just one of the 250 M1 A2 SEP-3 newest version of American tanks, and we buying equipment in South Korea. So I'm always emphasizing, if there's a will, there is solution. Of course, we have to increase the production in Europe. Best will be the European tank. But this is a question about the next 10 years. We don't have a time. The aspiration for Poland is 300,000 army, the biggest ground army in NATO in Europe. But if you have 300,000 soldiers, you're taken from economy. So it's good for security, but Prime Minister has to, keep the balance, how to use 300,000 soldiers in a uniform, not an economy for our development. It's a big strategical risk. The good thing is, Poland is very much unique, having agreement between three important elements of a system. First is this political guidance. No matter how the political scene is polarized, in Poland, politicians say more for security, more for army. And this is agreement, which is a little bit unique in Europe. We have different perspectives and different political agenda. Then we have economical affordability. So if you look at the map, 1990, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, more or less, we had the same similar GDP. And today, the Polish GDP is equal to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova. It matters. So the economical affordability gives you a chance to buy equipment with some kind of political, economical risk as well. And of course, very important, the last point is the social agreement. Poles, we understand, is not about emotions. Poles are very much romantic anyway. But if you see what happened in the recent years, the answer is easy. So I think in Europe, and especially here, we should consider how to use that kind of lovely synchronization in Poland, as an inspiration or also as a support for another political processes. Poland also took a huge political risk opening the borders for Ukrainians in the very first day when the war started. So 8 million Ukrainians crossed the border, to be honest, with no control. We just opened the houses and absorbed 8 million Ukrainians. Some of them moved back to Ukraine, some of them are Europe, Germany, France, Canada, everywhere else. But it matters, I think. So the relations between Poland and Ukraine are absolutely critical for strategical geometry. Everything I said is easy. There are facts. There's no discussion about if or about why. There are facts. So how about the question marks? We have a couple of question marks. First is Russia. Do we have agreement? Do we have a common imagination of Russia tomorrow and after tomorrow? Russia strong or Russia weak? So Russia strong with Chinese support, Korean equipment, Iranian drones, or Russia weak with 5,000 nuclear weapons, warheads without control and the implosion inside. So what kind of Russia we are afraid of? What kind of strategy we're preparing? How smart we're spending money to prevent Russia if we don't have agreement what the Russia is about? The highest and the most important document in NATO, which is the NATO strategic concept, says directly that Russia is enemy. It's easy. It's a sentence, and the Secretary General, he communicates everywhere. Russia is the main threat. And then we see that Trump is building negotiation table with Russians. So we have some kind of confusion right now. How to deal with that kind of threat? So dealing by negotiations, this is not the language the Russians understand. Well, we have a couple of formats that we can use for better understanding and communication. One of them mentioned by you was the format Poland, France, Germany, UK, potentially maybe in other countries. This is important, but first we have to deconflict very much internal national interests. They're crossing each other in every single direction. So energy policy is going in a different directions. immigration issue is going to different directions. And even in NATO, you mentioned 5% GDP. I love the sentence about lying. So today is 2025. 2025. We have 3 years of war, conventional war. Russia invaded Ukraine. Or even more, because my calculus is war started in 1914. We promise and we agree more than 10 years ago, we're spending 2%, only 2% GDP for defense. And we're not spending. Some of the countries are not spending. This is not fair. Some of the countries spending 5, or sending some of 1.3. So it is a matter of perception of threat. So if that 5% will be achievable, the next 20 years is far away behind my imagination what Russia would do that way. So it's just for reflection, to be fair, to say the facts, not simulations. Another format, just leaving you with that kind of impression, is very much natural. This is Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, because we're sharing the same perception of threat, Sweden and Finland, and potentially UK, or anybody else, Romania. So let's imagine something, think unthinkable, how to mitigate all of those challenges we have in NATO by building something which will be inspiration for other countries, how to use potential, as I mentioned, Poland and Finland as one of the hundreds of examples, how to use it properly. So, question mark. So Napoleon said, that will be a challenge because I don't speak French. Okay, Napoleon said, une bataille se gagne d'abord avec l'imagination. Was it any good?
A battle is won thanks to imagination.
And at one time, I'm still repeating, going everywhere, the sentence when I had a conversation with Valery Zaluzhny, the chief of defense of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Now he's His Excellency Ambassador in the UK. And I said, Valery, brother, tell me, what's the definition of victory? And there was a pretty long minute of silence, and he said, well, Ray, the victory will be if the Russians are not able to be back again. And he said, you're Polish, and they will be back again. So let's imagine what Napoleon said. Let's imagine victory, how to fulfill that kind of, Zaluzhny quote about the victory with Russians, because this is not easy. The last point, I was really happy to be on board of the La Redoutable, the submarine, going around a big beast, very little, and I said, well, that was very easy, black and white. There was a French argument, French nuclear instrumentarium, with very easy black and white 0-1 environment. We are here, Soviets are here. And the name, I love the name, because the La Redoutable is a kind of a message for us to be much more La Redoutable. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for this enlightenment to the possible evolution between the Baltic and the Black Sea. It's a space that is very much neglected by the Western Europe, and I think there are some synergies that can be deployed, and this goes back to the former Poland in the 16th century, and the superficie was twice as big as France. So, General Lute, if you want to talk about the state of NATO, the perspectives, I will give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, not only because it's a beautiful venue, but I really like the subject. I like the topic. I like the organizing theme, because it reminds me of the last time many of us in the room experienced a global shift, the changing of the tectonic plates as we're experiencing today. And of course, I'm referring to 1989 to 1991. When the world changed fundamentally. At that time, I was much younger, a US Army major, and I was in a unit that was patrolling the inter-German border, right? And in October of 1989, we imagined that the world would never change, that my unit would be there patrolling this border forever, and things would always tomorrow be as they were yesterday. And of course, the wall fell. Within a year, Germany was reunited. Within another year, the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union dissolved, and the world was forever changed, right? So the theme of this conference is, here we are again. We're experiencing another tectonic shift of the global power order. And I think that it's an appropriate topic because it was clear that during the Cold War, we were dominated by the bipolar struggle between two superpowers. And then after 89 to 91, we moved into perhaps 25 or 30 years of a unipolar world where the West, the combined power of the US and Europe, the West dominated, and we did largely as we pleased. And it's clear now that there's competition for the new world order. And some of it is already obvious, right? The US will remain a power center in this new order. And China has made its intent obvious. It will be a power center in this multipolar world. I think the war in Ukraine very much has to do with Vladimir Putin saying, what about me? Will Russia be one of these power centers? And he's trying to prove that he will. And that's still an open question, right? And I think for Europe, and this really gets back to the theme of this conference, what about Europe? Will Europe be able to combine the political cohesion of the European Union and the economic potential of the European Union with enough hard power to compete to be one of these power centers? But what seems increasingly clear, and I am going to get to the NATO summit, right? But what seems increasingly clear is that the West, as we knew it, is no longer. And the question for Europe will be, will European allies, will the European Union cohere and become a power center in its own right, alongside, in many cases, alongside the United States, but not united in the way that we're all familiar with as we grew up. And so the NATO summit earlier this week at The Hague sort of played out. It played out in the midst of this dramatic international change. As a former NATO ambassador, I like to remind that for every NATO summit, there's really only one product, only one deliverable, and that is the image, the perception of unity and solidarity, right? All for one for all. And on this count, I give the Hague Summit high marks. I mean, it did present the image of unity. I'll come back to this in a second. The second major outcome of the summit was this now somewhat famous 5% pledge, right? But as my fellow general noticed, or mentioned, this is a pledge that only comes due in 10 years, so long after Donald Trump, right? And it's a pledge that competes actually with the social and economic priorities of our European allies. So it's not at all clear to me that it's much more than a pledge at this point. I would frankly like NATO to shift its attention away from the inputs of defense spending, right? The money spent, the percentage of GDP and all that, which is somewhat artificial, and focus more on the outputs. What are we getting for 2%, 3%, or 4%? And here, NATO actually knows the answer to this question. But NATO is not transparent publicly with the answer to this question. NATO classifies the results of its defense capabilities so as not to advertise vulnerabilities or capability gaps. But I think there's room for NATO defense ministers, NATO parliamentarians, and so forth to be much more clear and transparent about who's providing the capabilities, no matter what they spend, and who is not. And so over time, I would be an advocate for a more capabilities-based assessment of membership in the alliance. But sure enough, 5% was agreed, and we'll see how that plays out. I think there was an undercurrent, there was a backdrop to the Hague summit, though, that many people missed. And that's the question of NATO values. NATO values. Now, how does this play out in the summit? Well, first of all, what are NATO values? The second sentence of the NATO treaty says that everybody who signs up to be a NATO ally abides by 3 fundamental values: democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. Okay? So before you get to Article 5, the famous defense pledge, you have to pass through these values, right? And it's really these values that are the glue of the alliance. So if we're back to alliance solidarity and alliance cohesion, we're talking about those 3 values. Well, so how's NATO doing on those values? Well, it's quite clear that there's a rise of authoritarian and populist governments, not wholesale across all 32 allies, but there's a clear trend. I mean, Mr. Orban's Hungary doesn't abide by those 3 values. Neither does Mr. Erdogan's Turkey. And as an American, I'd have to tell you, I have suspicions about Mr. Trump's America, okay? So if those values aren't the glue, if they're not the thing that coheres NATO, then it really doesn't matter if we spend 3, 4, or 5% on defense spending. And in this way, I worry about the Hague Summit. And the reason I worry about it is the tone, the atmosphere of the Hague Summit was one of, in my view, groveling for Donald Trump's attention and groveling for his approval. That does not abide by the 3 underlying values of the NATO alliance. And as a result, I think, okay, sure, we can declare it a success. They got the family photo, right, which is the image of cohesion, right? And you got the 5% pledge, and that may or may not turn out to be a good move, right? But I do worry about the slow erosion away from the 3 founding values of the alliance. So what grade would I give the Hague Summit? I guess I'd give it a B-, somewhere in there, C+, B-. We made it. It wasn't a disaster, but I do worry about the backdrop.
Merci beaucoup pour votre appréciation et puis pour la...
Thank you very much for the appreciation and for the grade you gave to the NATO summit, because we did avoid the worst. It is what is at stake is to push back deadlines as much as possible, so at least we have a bit of visibility and some perspectives for the future. So I do have one question for each of you, so I will give them now, and then you can decide which one you want to answer to and react to each other's speeches. And I don't know how it will be organized, but maybe we can take questions from the room. So first of all, in your review on the foreign affairs debate in the US, there was nothing on Ukraine. I would like to have some views on the public opinion in the US. Not immediately, of course, I will ask all the questions first, but maybe if you can enlighten us on where we are at. Do you think there is a burden shifting on Ukraine, or is it Europe who should be in charge on strategic solidarity? But for a country outside of Europe, well, so on Ukraine, General Andrzejak, if you could tell us a few words on the relationships between Poland and Ukraine in 2022, 2023. We had the feeling that there was a resurrection of this new ensemble, what I was mentioning earlier, the first Polish Republic, and then we saw later on that there was a strong nationalism defined in opposition to the neighbor, so where we had this idea of a federalized ensemble, this seems to be pushed back. And this can have negative consequences for this entity, this geopolitical, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, that needs to be strengthened to be a barrier, an obstacle to Russia, as General Pilsudski mentioned, between the two wars. And General Lute, I want to have an insight on how in NATO we think about China. A few years ago, we thought about a China turn from NATO. Of course, now it's not true anymore, but we see that there is an interconnection between the strategic relationship, the Pacific Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, or in Atlantic. So if we look at the NATO map, we see all the different routes and all the possibilities between China and Russia. We see that we can weigh in or parallelly in the Pacific. So it seemed quite important for Americans a few years back that some of the Europeans, such as France, are much more engaged in the Pacific region, to have Indo-Pacific strategies being adopted. And since the new administration, we have the feeling that who cares, basically, in Europe? There's not much we expect from you. So a NATO, a transatlantic alliance that would be semi-globalized or maybe regionalized, is it to counter Russia? And that's it. And we stay in our corner, and then to have Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, and the Philippines. So these are the two questions. We can now start with you.
Americans want Ukraine to win and Russia to lose. Polls show this. Polls overwhelmingly, by 80% plus margins, show that Americans believe Russia is an adversary, have an unfavorable view of Russia, do not want to see Russia prevail. A number that comes to mind also is that 86% of Americans, according to a survey I saw just last week, are highly concerned about this axis of autocracy between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. 86%. What has happened over the last 3 years since Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine? That axis of autocracy has gotten much stronger, right? Asians are fighting in Europe for the first time since the 14th century in the form of this North Korean army. Iran has been a battlefield combatant in Ukraine through its drone strikes, its drone provision to Russia. China has provided 90%, according to former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken of the Biden administration. China has provided 90%, 90, of the microelectronics and other technologies required for the Russian war machine. Okay? So the American critique, I think, of where we have been on Ukraine is President Biden did not have a strategy to win. Americans want to win. They don't want a forever war. They did not like forever war in Afghanistan or Iraq. There was a concern that Ukraine is turning into a forever war because we had no strategy for victory, right? The Biden administration, all of its public pronouncements were about the weapon systems it would not provide to Ukraine. We would not provide tanks. Then later we provided tanks. We will not provide combat aircraft. Then later we provided combat aircraft. We would not provide HIMARS. Then later we provided HIMARS. We will not provide ATACMS. Then later we provided ATACMS. We broadcast to the Russians that we were not serious about victory in Ukraine. We could have had victory in Ukraine in the first year without a NATO troop member on the ground. We could have had it in the first year. Russia was on its back. The generals can speak much more to this. Putin had lost half of his combat power, half of his army, after the first year, right? But we were not serious about winning. What happened in our politics is Americans got tired of watching senators and congressmen vote every 6 months to spend $50, $60, $70 billion supporting this war effort in Ukraine, and not just supporting the war. I support Ukrainian victory and Russia's defeat, but American taxpayers were paying for the pensions of civil servants in Ukraine, right? American taxpayers are not paying for the pensions of most Americans, but we were paying for the pensions of Ukrainian bureaucrats. So the politics changed in the United States. I had many members of Congress tell me I would vote in a second for this Ukraine resolution, this package of spending, if I knew we had a strategy to win. They saw no strategy. These are great Russia hawks. So I think we all need to be serious about a strategy for victory in Ukraine. And by the way, there's a big European role. I know everyone would love to talk about Donald Trump. $300 billion of Russian assets are frozen. Nearly all of those are in Europe. Why haven't you released them to support the Ukrainian war effort? Putin has no right under international law to frozen Russian assets. He has violated every law in the attacks on Ukrainian civilians and the attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. He has violated not just the laws of war, but the laws of decency and humankind. He should have no legal protection for those sovereign Russian assets. They are sitting in Europe. You should seize them and you should use them to arm Ukraine and rebuild Ukraine. I hate to mention this is my last thought. Europe is still reliant on Russian energy assets for almost 20% of European energy consumption. Why are you still importing Russian energy? I'd like to know, I still don't understand. That energy, those oil and gas receipts are fueling the war. It is a war against Europe and a war against the West. Stop buying Russian energy. Thank you.
So let me agree with my American colleague that the reason we are where we are today in Ukraine is because what I refer to as a strategic disconnect between how important we said this was or is, and then the incremental, too little, too slow approach to resources. And whenever you have a disconnect between goals, ways, and means, you don't have a strategy and you end up being unsuccessful. Now, why should any of us have confidence in the Ukrainian military effort? Let me tell you a short story, I will be short, that should give you confidence. So in a recent visit to Kyiv last September, a couple of Americans got on a bus and we went out and went to a drone unit. So a Ukrainian unit, its only mission is to fly drones, right? And as good Americans, we were wearing Kevlar helmets and flak jackets. We get off our little bus, and the Ukrainian drone commander comes up to greet us. He's wearing a baseball hat backwards, okay, and a Grateful Dead t-shirt, okay? And he's killing Russians every day. So we are talking to these soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers in the drone unit. And I said, well, where do you get your drones? And of course, as a good American, I imagined he would say, oh, the US. No US drones. They're too expensive, they're not effective, and so forth. I said, well, how about this one? Where does it come from? He says, oh, we buy that from China. I said, wait a second, I'm confused. I thought China was supporting Russia. He goes, well, we buy it on the open market. I said, what open market? He says, Amazon. I said, now I'm really confused. How do they get delivered? He says, we go to the nearest village and we pick them up. How do you pay for them? We have a Donate Now button on our battalion website. People crowdsource the purchase of Chinese drones that are delivered by Amazon to kill Russians. We should have confidence in this army. This is the Ukrainian army that will win.
Alors, je suis désolé, mais il va falloir...
So, unfortunately, but you have to be as brief as possible. You have 1 minute, or maybe 30 seconds on Ukraine and Poland, very briefly. And 30 seconds, maybe we can continue these discussions later. But thank you very much for your contributions.
Enough time factor working right now. Okay, a few words. Ukraine. I will quote again a very famous sentence which was presented by our president of Poland, Kaczynski. It was 2008, and there was a Russian invasion in Georgia. And he said, looking in the situation, it was personally in Georgia at that time, and he said, today Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, after tomorrow Baltic states, and maybe one day my country. That was 2008. That's what he said. I met him personally in 2008 when I commanded a brigade in Afghanistan. It was just right after the visit. So, well, it's not rocket science, it's just history and knowing strategy. So we see what the Russians, they did in Ukraine, Georgia, and in Ukraine 2014. Our punishment for Russia in 2008 was Nord Stream 1. That was a kind of a punishment. So then in 2014, they invaded Crimea. So our West punishment was Nord Stream 2. So when the war started, I asked one of my friends from a certain country, are we preparing Nord Stream 3 for Russia as a kind of punishment? You know what I mean? So it's serious. Very first day, Prime Minister and the politicians moved immediately to Kiev to send a message, we are standing with you. And that was exactly, I remember the situation with the javelins. There was the tanks, don't send the tanks because it's too escalatory. No Leopards, no HIMARSes, no F-16s. And what's up? And we see everything is flying and fighting right now over the Ukraine. But we are too late, always too late. In the wartime, always in the battle, is a matter of momentum. Just to take decision. When I was in Slavkov, in the Czech Republic, which is very famous, Austerlitz, I was standing on the hill and I'm thinking about, Napoleon says, right now, there was no satellites, no artificial, intelligence at that time. He knew. So we should be more like Napoleon, knowing what was the time to support Ukraine, when always too late. And there was Piłsudski first, who understand geostrategic, geometry. For Russia, for Russian imperialism, there's no other way. Ukraine is necessary because emotions, because the Kiev Rus, because this is a gate to Moscow. And the same was Brzezinski repeating in his famous book about the great chessboard. And let's imagine picture, because one picture, 1,000 words. Sorry, but this is not PowerPoint presentation, but close your eyes and let's imagine line. The line goes from Finland down, and then goes to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and then Slovakia, and go down to Black Sea, Romania. This is the line, front line. If the line will be a little bit changed and the Ukraine will be in this line, this is a nightmare for Russians. Because any projection of instrumentarium, projection of force from Moscow in philosophical level to the West will be flanked by Ukraine. It's easy. Okay. It's like basics. So if we change the line a little bit, so Ukraine in NATO, that is the answer to the importance of Ukraine, there'll be different geometry. And don't forget one thing, this line is already penetrated because Kaliningrad is in the other side of the line.
Thank you.
So that's the strategical geometry we have to consider. Just picture.
Thank you. I have to draw a line. I'm sorry for that.